Thank you, Terry. Thank you as always. As we were singing that song, I just thought, we sing that and it says that I love to tell the story will be my theme throughout glory, to tell the old story. So think about it. In heaven, we're going to be rejoicing and just telling the story of Jesus' love and his death on the cross and redeeming us and all of that. And all through eternity, we're just going to celebrate the gospel, talk about the gospel. We oftentimes say life is rehearsal for heaven, for a believer, right? So doesn't it just make sense that we need to be in the habit of talking about and sharing the gospel, but not just among ourselves, but with those that need to hear it? Because throughout eternity, we're going to be celebrating the gospel. So you know what? You just might as well get used to it now. Amen? All right, it's good to see you and glad that you're here with us tonight. As I mentioned a few moments ago, if you haven't picked one up, I've told you for some time that I was not satisfied with the copy of the map that I had printed and put out and that we've had here. And so I've had in the back of my mind to go in there and see if I can't improve that thing. Anybody that needs one, Tom's got some to distribute right there if you want a new copy of the map. It's much better. And because it was so fuzzy, I couldn't even read it up here on the screen when I was pointing things out. So I played around with the copier today, and lo and behold, guess what? I found higher resolution, and it worked. And so with that being said, so here's what I want to do. I want to take just a few minutes and kind of orient us as to where we are in the book of Gideon tonight in chapter number 9. And so right here in this yellow section of West Manasseh is Shechem. So if you've got your map, you'll find Shechem right here. It's a very important city throughout Old Testament history. Abraham spent time there when Israel crossed the Jordan. And you remember we're in the book of Joshua. After a period of time, one of the first things that they did was they journeyed to Shechem, and the congregation assembled in that area and noticed that Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim are right there, and one part of them were by Gerizim and one part by Ebal, and they did the blessings and the cursings and so forth, and they renewed the covenant there. We'll touch on that a little bit here later on. So what we're going to be looking at tonight is based in that area. Shechem, Abimelech, one of the sons of Gideon that we mentioned at the end of the service last week. We're going to be focusing on him this morning or this evening. But also another name, Mount Ebal. As we get towards the end of chapter number 9, we're going to hear about a Mount Zalmon. Mount Zalmon and Mount Ebal are one and the same. Okay, so just so you have an idea of where we are on the geography with our map and so forth. And so with that, let's get into our study in Judges 9 this evening. You'll notice I've got 6 things here. And the first thing we're going to talk about in verses 1 through 6 is Abimelech's ascendancy. And so here's what we're talking about. We're talking about his rise to power. He becomes, think about this. Let me ask you this question. If somebody were to come to you and say, okay, who's the first king of Israel? Who is it? Saul. But in reality, Abimelech is the first one that was actually crowned and called king of Israel. Now, his was not a legitimate reign. That's the thing about it. And we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But that son, Abimelech, that we read about towards the end of chapter 8 last week, who, by the way, his name means my father is king, or it can be translated my father was king, but more than likely it was considered to mean my father is king, because remember that after Gideon's success in driving out the Midianites, that the people wanted to make him king, and he declined. And then, of course, he goes on and he makes the mistake of making this ephod, which was something that only the priest were privileged to use, and that became a snare for Israel. And then we're introduced at the end we're told that he had many wives. He had 70 sons by those many wives. But then the following verse says, but he also had a concubine who lived in Shechem, and he had a son by her whose name was Abimelech, which means my father is king. And so you have to ask the question, and this was brought up towards the end of the session last time, did Gideon, and Gideon named him Abimelech, Gideon gave him that name. And so you have to wonder, was Gideon regret, maybe I should have taken that position as king? Don't really know, but he gives his son this name. So then that brings us to where the real problem begins in chapter number 9. Because the thing that you find in chapter number 9 in Judges here is a problem that is reflected in the name of Abimelech, but also his very poor character. He was not a good man. His father was a good man, and it's an amazing story. We've talked about it. He starts out fearful, hiding in a wine press. God speaks of him as God sees him, what he will become. By the end, man, he's this mighty warrior that God is using and so forth. But he kind of backslides. He makes the mistake of having married many wives. That never works out good. Listen, throughout the Old Testament, every person that you find, every man that you find who married multiple wives, and he may have been a godly man, a good man, it created problems in his family and in his life and in his ability to be able to serve God. Here was the problem. Polygamy was never God's plan. It was all part of the culture, and they were adopting the culture. Now, despite that fact, God still used it to accomplish his purposes and plans, but it was never part of his intent. It was always a stumbling block. And so it was with Gideon. And then, of course, so he has many wives, 70 sons by those many wives. Then he has a concubine in Shechem and has a son by her, names him Abimelech, who was, as I said, not a man of good character. He was not a good man, as we'll see more and more as we make our way through this. So what happens is, apparently, Abimelech was a bitter man, because his mother was the concubine. She was a second-rate wife. She was left behind in Shechem. Gideon's other wives were probably with him wherever it was that he lived and so forth. He grew up bitter. He turns out to be a very ruthless man. And I suppose he took this idea, well, my father gave me this name, Abimelech. My father is king. Well, he never got to reign. Well, guess what? I'm going to. And you probably could describe Abimelech as being an ambitious man. And he could have been motivated to some degree by ambition, but he was motivated more than anything else by bitterness. And his bitterness was combined with ruthlessness to accomplish and get whatever it is that he wanted. So we pick up beginning in verse number 1 with his ascendancy, his rise to power. And we start with verse 1. And we've got a lot of scripture tonight, so we're going to be reading a lot. But I'll tell you what, you read through this, it would make a great Lifetime movie. So we start at verse number 1. It says, then Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, which, by the way, remember that was a name ascribed to Gideon, he went to Shechem to his mother's brothers. Now, that could mean a couple of things. That you could say, well, his half-brothers, in other words, sons that she might have bore by other men. More than likely, it's referring to his uncles. Ultimately, it really refers to his entire family clan, because notice it says he goes on and he spoke with them and all the family of his mother's father. So in other words, here's what was happening. Because his mother was Gideon's concubine, she was left behind in Shechem. Gideon pay her a visit every now and then. But she was not allowed to be with the rest of the family, the other wives, the other children. That meant Abimelech was excluded. Remember, Gideon's got 70 sons. Abimelech does not get to experience growing up with those 70 brothers. He's left out. because she was the concubine, the second-class wife. She had to stay with her family. And so Abimelech's family of identity was his mother's family, and they were all in Shechem, okay? So he goes to them saying, verse number 2, please speak in the hearing of all the men of Shechem. And that word men of Shechem literally means the rulers, the lords, the Baals. It's actually a word Baal, but it means the lords of the Shechemites, the ruling class there. And he said, ask them this question, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons reign over you, that is, the 70 sons of Abimelech? Is it better for you for all of them to rule over you, or that one reign over you? And then he goes on and he says, remember that I am your own flesh and bone. In other words, says, I'm your kinfolk. I grew up here with you. My mother grew up here with you. My mother's father and her family are right here for me. We've been here. Those other sons of Gideon, they're not a part of this. So ask yourself a question. Would you rather those 70 rule over you or me? One that's from your bunch. And verse number 3 says, and his mother's brothers spoke all these words concerning him in the hearing of all the men of Shechem. And their heart was inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. He's one of us. So they gave him, now listen to this, so they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith. So they went and they robbed Baal, and they took these 70 shekels of silver, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless men, and they followed him. Now let me tell you something. Here's a little secret. Worthless and reckless men don't follow good guys. They follow guys that are even more ruthless and reckless than they are. So that tells you something about Abimelech. Verse 5, then he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, on one stone. So on one site, some large stone somewhere, or it might have been a particular place of execution where they executed every one of them one at a time, but they were all killed same time in one place by their brother Abimelech. Half brother, yes, but brother nonetheless. And then he goes on and says, but Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, so the youngest of the 70 sons, was left because he hid himself. And all the men of Shechem gathered together, all of Beth Millo, and what that is, it's a fortification. So as we make our way through this, you're going to hear about the Tower of Shechem, and it is believed that Beth Millo is simply a reference, a different term for the Tower of Shechem. It's a fortification of some sort, okay? And so the men of Shechem all gather at Beth Millo, and they went and they made Abimelech king beside the terebinth tree at the pillar that was in Shechem. So get this picture here. You got the men of Shechem, a very important, significant city in the Old Testament, as I mentioned earlier. Abraham spent time there. The covenant was renewed there as soon as they got into the promised land and they got settled. And they anoint this ruthless. So here's the thing. Art's already a picture. He's a ruthless, bitter man. He's running around with a gang of ruthless and reckless men. The Shechemites have given him money. You got a very bad man, now the king, ruling over a very group of very bad people. Not a good fit, right? And they are making him king. They had no authority from God. There's nothing where God is legitimizing this at all. So while we said a few minutes ago the first person ever crowned king in Israel is Abimelech, it's not legitimate because God is not in this at all, okay? And by the way, right here where they anointed him king, it talks about this terebinth tree. If we go back into the book of Joshua, remember we talked about Joshua took Israel over there, and at least the elders and certain key ones, and they renewed the covenant. Well, back there in Joshua, we read that when they renewed the covenant, Joshua took a copy of the 10 Commandments and set them at this terebinth tree. The very site where Joshua placed those 10 Commandments, a copy of the covenant, at the foot of that tree is the very place where they anoint and the coronation of Abimelech takes place. God's word is right there in front of them, and they ain't paying one bit of attention to it. Gives you an idea of where their mindset is, right? And then we go from that, we move on from point number 2 is Jotham's prophecy. Remember, Jotham is the youngest of those 70 sons. He hid himself. He was not executed by Abimelech and his reckless men. And so here's what he does. His prophecy is a pronouncement of a curse. And so God is using Jotham to pronounce a curse that is going to come up on judgment, that's going to come up on Abimelech and the men and the people of Shechem for what they've done. And for what they've done to Gideon's sons. Verse 7 says this, and he uses what's called the parable of the trees. And here's how he does it. So you think about Jesus used parables all the time. Well, here God through Jotham is using a parable to give this pronouncement of this curse. Verse 7. Now, when they told Jotham, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim, and he lifted his voice. All right, so we pointed out Mount Gerizim there just a few moments ago. And he lifted his voice and cried out, and he said to them. Now, let me tell you, here's the reason why he's on Mount Gerizim. It comes back to the very reason why we go back to the book of Joshua. When Joshua took Israel to Shechem and to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and where they read the blessings and the cursings, the reason why God had chosen Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal was because the land between those two mountains made like a natural amphitheater. You ever been in an amphitheater? Why are amphitheaters so important, especially in the ancient world? The acoustics. So at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and the natural amphitheater, when you would speak with a human voice, it carried. That's the reason why they assembled there, because everybody could hear. Jotham goes up to Mount Gerizim, back there to that amphitheater, and Shechem is right down in front of it, and he gives this parable, and everybody in Shechem can hear everything that's being said. And here's what he says. Listen to me, you men of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went forth to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree. Now, in the life of Israel, the olive tree is the tree. I mean, it is the symbol of Israel, the olive tree. It's premier. And he says, they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, should I cease giving my oil with which they honor God and men and go sway over trees? And verse 10, and then the tree said to the fig tree. Second most important tree in the life of Israel is the fig tree. It's also a symbol of Israel. And it's a symbol of God's blessing. Every man will sit under his fig tree. That's a picture of blessing and prosperity of God upon his people. And now they go to the fig tree. You come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, should I cease my sweetness and my good fruit and go sway over the trees? And then they said to the vine, another very important picture, right? And symbol in the life of the nation of Israel. All of these are quality, top notch. You want the olive tree. You want the fig tree. You want the vine. That's the best of the best, all right? The best of the best are saying no to them. And they go and to the trees said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, should I cease my new wine, which cheers both God and men, and go sway over the trees? The best of the best have said, no, I don't want nothing to do with you. Verse 14. Then all the trees said to the bramble. You know what a bramble is? It's a thorn bush. It's worthless. He's describing Abimelech. He's a worthless man. Now, I just got to say this right here. I see a picture of where we are in America. Our choices ain't real good. The olive tree and the fig tree and the vine saying no, and we got bramble. They were getting what they deserved. A little bit close to home, ain't it? Then all the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in truth you anoint me as king over you, then you come and take shelter under my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. In other words, here's what the bramble is saying. If I rule over you, I'm going to rule over you with oppression. And if you don't do what I say, and if you disagree with me, you're going to feel my fury. It's a description of the character of the kind of man that Abimelech was. Abimelech was not a reasonable man. He was not the kind of man that you could go to and reason with, disagree with, without him being offended and have it out for you because, you know, it's kind of like the children's story, you know, the king has no clothes. But nobody dares say anything and speak the truth, right? Why? Head's going to be cut off. That's a great children's story, isn't it? But that's what's going on. It is just describing how bad a man, worthless a man. He reminds me of Nabal, the fool. David dealt with him. He was a fool because nobody could reason with him. He couldn't listen to anybody. And so he's described as bramble, and which back in that day was a constant, nothing but a nuisance to the farmers and so forth. Verse 16. Now therefore, listen, this is Jotham. He continues now after he's done the parable of the trees. Now therefore, if you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech king. Now think about, listen to that. If what you've done is in truth and sincerity, if it's right, okay, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, well, you know what the answer to that is. What did they do to Jerubbaal and his house? Slaughtered the sons. And basically turned on the whole house of Gideon after all that Gideon had done to serve and lead and help. And you have done to him as he deserves. Verse 17, for my father fought for you, risked his life, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. But you've risen up against my father's house to this day and killed his 70 sons on one stone, and made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the men of Shechem, because he is your brother. If then you've acted in truth and sincerity with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and Beth Millo, and let fire come from the men of Shechem from Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled, and he went to Beer and dwelt there for the fear of Abimelech and his brother. In other words, he's saying, look, if what you all have done is kosher and it's good and it's right, everything will be fine. Have a party. But if it's not, here's the judgment of God that's going to come upon you. He's going to turn on you and destroy you, and you're going to turn on him and destroy him. Okay? So, number 3, we come to Shechem's treachery. Shechem turns on Abimelech. Verse 22, after Abimelech had reigned over Israel 3 years, God sent a spirit of ill will between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. And the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. So the prophecy of Jotham was not fulfilled immediately. 3 years passed. I imagine by the end of those 3 years, getting close, they're all thinking, that fool Jotham, he didn't know what he was talking about. He's just blowing hot air. Look, everything's just going wonderful. Until the end of 3 years come. And then it changes. And 3 years pass, and then what Jotham said begins to come to pass. Now, and so notice it says, and God sent a spirit of ill will between Abimelech and Shechem. Let me ask you a question. So, what is the significance? To what end did God send this ill will between Abimelech and Shechem? Why did he do that? Okay. God had pronounced judgment was coming, right? Judgment is going to come upon Abimelech, and it's going to come upon Shechem. All right? And God is, and here's the thing, you're dealing with ungodly, evil, wicked, worthless people who are completely unrepentant, and I would even say beyond being unrepentant. They are beyond even realizing how evil and wicked their schemes and behavior is. Okay, so let me give you know what Paul talks about in Romans chapter number 1, where he talks about how he gave certain Gentiles over to a reprobate mind to do all kinds of worthless things. The reason why he gave them over to a reprobate mind, why? They were so far gone that they were beyond being reached. They didn't get it. And so God gave them over. So you're dealing with a bunch of reprobates right here that are beyond the capacity of repentance. All they're going to do for as long as they live is evil and wickedness and ungodliness of every kind you could possibly imagine. And so God has determined judgment is coming. And so he helps it out a little bit. He throws a little fuel on the fire and puts some ill will in there to make sure his judgment upon these reprobate, wicked men comes to pass. Now you can say, that just don't sound cool. Who are you to judge God? That's what I would say. Who are we to question God's ways? All right? Verse 24. So God sends this spirit of ill will that the crime done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might be settled, and their blood be laid on Abimelech, their brother who killed him, and on the men of Shechem who aided him in the killing of his brothers. So God is bringing vengeance upon them for what they did to Gideon and to his sons. Verse 25, and the men of Shechem set men in ambush against him, that is against Abimelech, on the tops of the mountains. And they robbed all who passed by along that way, and it was told to Abimelech. So here's what they were doing. Remember, he's the king, right? He owns all the trade routes. He gets the primary spoils of all the profit and the benefit of what happens on those trade routes and the transactions and everything, okay? So by them beginning to ambush people on these trade routes, they're getting into Abimelech's back pocket. And what they were trying to do, they were trying to lure him to come and intervene so that they could ambush him as well. But he doesn't buy it. It doesn't work out that way, all right? So Shechem has now turned on Abimelech. The wheels are in motion, beginning God's judgment to come upon them, okay? Point number 4, we come to Zebul's loyalty, verses 30 and 33. So this is a guy who's loyal to Abimelech. When Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal the son of Ebed, his anger was aroused. And he sent messengers to Abimelech, secretly saying, take note, Gaal the son of Ebed and his brothers have come to Shechem, and here they are, fortifying the city against you. Now therefore, get up by night, you and the people. So here's what he's doing. He's helping to formulate a plan for Abimelech. He's suggesting, here's the way you ought to consider attacking them. He says, now get up by night, you and the people who are with you, and lie in wait in the field. And it shall be, as soon as the sun is up in the morning, You shall rise early and rush upon the city, and when he and the people who are with him come out against you, you may then do to them as you find opportunity. So what he's saying is this: come at night, lay in wait until morning time, and when they get up in the morning, are you like me when you get up in the morning? You're not ready for a whole lot of action. You know, I gotta get my caffeine going and get the cobwebs out of the head and all that sort of stuff. You know, before you start the day. And so that's what he's saying. As soon as they wake up in the morning, you're going to jump on them, because everybody's a little bit unfocused when they first get up, right? Most people, anyway. And so we come to verse number 5. That works. Abimelech's victory, verses 34 to 49. Now, I say this is Abimelech's victory. Let me qualify this. It is a victory of ruthless revenge. But there again, you got to understand something. God's using Shechem to bring judgment on Abimelech, but he's also using Abimelech to bring judgment on Shechem. And God takes the ruthlessness of both parties to bring judgment on each. Verse 34. So Abimelech and all the people who were with him, they rose by night, lay in wait. Verse 35. When Gaal, the son of Ebed, went out and he stood in the entrance to the city gate. Here he is, getting up in the morning. It's a beautiful morning. Boom. Here it comes, all right? Abimelech and the people who were with him rose from lying in wait, and when Gaal saw the people, he said to Zebul, look, people are coming down from the tops of the mountains. Now look, so he saw, listen, even though he's still got that morning fog, he sees all these people starting to come at him. And Zebul says this: oh no, you just see the shadows of the mountains. No, you're not seeing clearly. That's just shadows. That's no big deal. You know, breeze blowing the trees, the sun reflecting shadows. That's not men. That's just shadows. So Gaal spoke again and said, see, people are coming down from the center of the land, and another company is coming from the diviner's terebinth tree, which would have been from the direction of that tree we talked about earlier, where Joshua had laid the law. And verse 38, then Zebul said to him, now listen to this. Where now is your mouth? Because he was bad-mouthing earlier. Where now is your mouth, which you said, who is Abimelech that we should serve him? Are not these people whom you despise? Go out, if you will, fight, and fight them now. And Gaal went out, leading the men of Shechem. They fought. Abimelech chased him. They fled. Many are wounded. Verse 41, Abimelech dwelt at Arumah, and Zebul drove out Gaal and his brothers so that they would not dwell in Shechem. And verse 42, and it came to pass, came about the next day, that the people went out in the field, and they told Abimelech. And so he took his people, divided in 3 companies. They lay in wait in the field and looked, and there were more people coming out of the city. And Abimelech and the company that was with him rushed forward, stood at the entrance of the gate, and the other 2 companies rushed. And Abimelech fought against the city all that day, verse 45, and he took the city and he killed the people who were in it, and he demolished the city and sowed it with salt. Why would he sow it with salt? Makes the ground inert. You can't grow anything. Verse 46. Now here's the real ruthlessness. Now when all the men of the tower of Shechem, that's also that Millo that we talked about, when the men of the tower of Shechem heard that, they entered the stronghold of the temple of the god Berith. Now here's the thing. That is all one and the same location. It's not a different location. In fact, it's likely that this temple may very well have been inside the tower, or the temple may also have been considered, or the tower may have been considered a temple to their god, all right? But they all go into this tower. And it was told Abimelech that all the men of the tower were gathered together. And so he goes up to Mount Zalmon, okay? So there's that different word for Mount Ebal that I pointed out on the map a few minutes ago. So Abimelech takes his troops, his soldiers, up to Mount Ebal, to Mount Zalmon, and they go and they take axes in hand, and they begin to cut down boughs from the tree. And he says to them in verse 48, what you see me do, you do the same. And so they all start cutting down firewood. And they bring it back to the tower, verse 49, and they put this firewood, these boughs that are very flammable, against the stronghold, and they set the stronghold on fire, so that all the people of the tower of Shechem died, about 1,000 men and women. So in other words, here's the thing. They burned the tower, they set it on fire, and 1,000 men and women inside of it died by fire. Now, that tower, more than likely, made of stone. So you think about, it may not have just been burned to death as much as roasted to death. Ruthless. God's using that for judgment. Which brings us to the last point. Judgment certainty, verses 50 through 57. Abimelech goes to Thebez and camps against it. But there, interesting. So how did he finally finish off the people of Shechem? Setting the tower on fire, either burning it up, or what, more than likely stone, probably cooking them to death. Okay, so a tower played a significant role there, right? Well, now he's in another place, and he encamps against Thebez, verse 51. But there was a strong tower in that city, and all the men and women, people of the city, fled there, and they shut themselves in because it was a fortification. So Abimelech came as far as the tower, and he fought against it, and he drew near the door of the tower to burn it with fire. He's essentially planning on doing the same thing here that he had just done in Shechem, except the story goes differently this time. And it says, verse 53, but a certain woman dropped an upper millstone. Now, that would have been a large stone that's put in the mill, and they would have been laid horizontal. And you've got a lower stone, you got an upper stone. Grain goes in between them. They grind against one another. That's how they would grind corn and wheat and so forth into flour and so forth. Somehow or another, there is this, in this tower, there is an upper millstone which would have had equal to greater weight than the lower millstone because the gravity of putting it on the grain to crush it. She manages somehow to push this upper millstone off of the tower onto Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. But he was so hard-headed, he didn't die. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and he said to him, now this just would not fly today, what he's about to say. Draw your sword and kill me, because I don't want anybody to know that a woman killed me. He was not only hard-headed, he was a male chauvinist. I told you it'd make a great Lifetime movie. So his young man thrust him through and he died. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, they departed, every man to his place. Now, that's 55 verses. But the moral of the story is in the last two. Thus God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father by killing his 70 brothers, and all the evil of the men of Shechem God returned on their own heads, and on them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. Now let me ask you a question. What would you say is the moral of that story? All right, you reap what you sow. If you sow to the flesh corruption of the flesh, you reap corruption. Okay.
I was thinking about how evil consumes evil. seems to me like you got evil, enough evil, eventually they'll start consuming.
Yeah.
The smarter man will listen to God.
Do what?
I said the smarter man will listen to God.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of like what you're talking about, evil. It's like there is no honor among thieves, or like in the mob, they take you out. It's just business, What would you say is the moral?
If Gideon had lived his life,
The what?
if Gideon had lived as he did, none of this.
True. So a lot of this goes back to Gideon's carelessness. He sowed a lot of this. He literally sowed the seed.
Maybe sin in our lives as consequences down the road. You think about it. It's time.
True.
Sins of the father.
True.
Don't mess with a woman with a
Merrill Unger, one of the great Bible commentators, he summed it up like this. He said this: God recompensed the Shechemites for their evil. Both the destruction of Shechem and the death of Abimelech were just recompense for the atrocities perpetrated against Gideon's family. And while what we're saying is that Gideon bears some fault for some of the seeds he sowed, but it wasn't deserving of what ultimately happened, certainly not to his 70 sons. And then he goes on and says, and the curse of Jotham was realized. Both Shechem and Abimelech were devoured as Jotham had predicted. Reminds me of Deuteronomy 32:35. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay. It also reminds me of Hebrews 9:29. It is appointed unto men once to die, and after that the judgment. Okay? All right, any questions, thoughts, comments? All right. We will conclude, and for those of you that are online, thank you for joining us. Have a blessed evening. All right, Brother Randy, I'll turn it over to you.